life. I'll be getting young till I die for the rest of my life. Do you think it's a good idea to twist tongues? Or do you think it's a good idea to sing songs? So do I every day. And for the rest of my life, I'll be getting young till I die. And for the rest of my life. So do you think it's a good idea to die young? Steve thinks it's a good idea to die young. So do I every day. And for the rest of my life, I'll be getting young till I die. And for the rest of my life.
Have expanded their investigation following the discovery of so-called forever chemicals in a number of private wells in the town of Fairfield.
The Department of Environmental Protection says 18 wells have tested higher than the EPA advisory levels for industrial chemicals known as PFAS. Earlier this year, high levels of the chemicals were found in milk from the Tozier dairy farm, believed to be from biosolids used as fertilizer for decades. News Center Maine's Vivian Lee has the latest.
Investigators from the Department of Environmental Protection have tested nearly 40 residential wells and water supplies near the Tozier dairy farm. So far, 18 wells have levels of PFAS chemicals that exceed the EPA safe limit. Town manager Michelle Fluelling says the town is distributing a 30-day supply of bottled water to impacted homeowners, but that may not be enough, especially since other homes are still to be tested.
We don't have confidence that the supply will maintain, especially if the numbers of wells continue to grow.
Earlier this year, toxic levels of PFAS were found in the farm's milk, soil, and feed. They are a class of industrial chemicals used in household goods to firefighting foam. Called forever chemicals because they take years to break down in the body and the environment, the compounds have been linked to a number of health issues, including immune system problems and organ cancers. The farm's milk supply was pulled from store shelves this summer. That contamination is believed to be from wastewater biosolids used as fertilizer on farmland for more than 25 years, a practice that is allowed in Maine.
The unfortunate reality is that those biosolids unfortunately did contain PFAS that is coming back at a highly elevated rate.
Earlier this month, before the town council, state environmental and health officials laid out their investigation. Penny Harkins lives near the farm. She says the contamination should be considered a state of emergency.
Bottled water isn't cutting it. It's not going to cover all of us, and it certainly does not make us feel good to have a plastic contaminant, and now we're forced to drink water out of a plastic bottle.
Now, this week, DEP officials are testing some of those private wells that had high levels of forever chemicals, and they're looking for other contaminants. Key data they'll need to design water treatment systems that will feature carbon filters. The DEP could begin installing filtration systems early next year. The town is also looking at grants to possibly extend water to affected residents. And tests are also underway on other land sites in central Maine where biosolids were used as fertilizer, but those results have yet to be released. In Fairfield, Vivian Lee, News Center, Maine.
And the town is providing information about PFAS, health concerns, and water testing by the Department of Environmental Protection, which is available on its website. And you can get to that on our website and mobile app.
Prose is custom hair care made for the label readers, the skeptics, and most of all,
it is an environmental disaster that went on for decades before it was discovered. Now, farmers who were at ground zero say a state plan to save them from financial disaster, it might not be enough. Good evening. Thanks for being with us. I'm Brian Yukono.
And I'm Amanda Hill. We all first became aware of PFAS chemicals 7 years ago when York County dairy farmer Fred Stone took our Vivian Lee into his fields and among his cows. All of them were producing milk that contained PFAS. They ingested it in the grass they ate and the water they drank.
That's because Stone was one of dozens of farmers who agreed to have sludge from water treatment plants spread over their fields as fertilizer. They didn't know it contained those so-called forever chemicals, a product of the wastewater from mills and homes. Well, now a state fund set up to help those farmers is ringing up a higher price tag, more than the $60 million already approved last year by lawmakers and Governor Janet Mills.
That PFAS fund has not distributed any money yet, and an advisory panel says it looks like more than $80 million will be needed over the next 5 years. And as News Center Maine's Vivian Lee shows us, farmers who have already been impacted say what money there is could end up being too little, too late.
Adam Nordell gets a little emotional when he talks about his organic grain farm, which he started with his wife, Johanna Davis.
It's so sad. It's a beautiful property, and we poured our work and our sweat and our blood and our tears.
The couple, who have a 5-year-old son, pulled products from the shelves and shuttered the farm last year after high levels of PFAS chemicals were discovered in their produce, soil, and drinking water. But he's hopeful the $60 million fund established last year by the legislature and Governor Janet Mills will help his family move forward. The fund will go to buying out contaminated land, helping farms transition to new forms of production, to paying for blood testing, screenings, and health monitoring for farmers, private landowners, families, and workers impacted by PFAS contamination. $500,000 will go to conducting a study utilizing blood donations to reduce levels of toxic chemicals in the blood.
Such a study could follow these participants over time for a long enough period to see if the faster reduction in blood PFAS level.
That possibility feels like a light at the end of a very dark tunnel.
The advisory committee now says the fund needs an additional $20.5 million to address the widespread crisis over the next 5 years. For Arundel dairy farmer Fred Stone, who first sounded the alarm about PFAS, the fund will be key to helping bring back his more than century-old dairy farm on a much smaller scale. Since January, Fred has been dumping the milk of about 40 of his brown Swiss and Holstein cows, which have elevated levels of PFAS. Every other month, the cow's blood and milk are tested by state agricultural officials. So far, the process has decreased the PFAS load in these cows by half, and Fred hopes to have all his cows' milk and blood levels to non-detect for PFAS in about a year.
We'll have a certificate saying that the cows are clean so that when we can merchandise them, we can do anything we want with them after that period of time.
The longtime farmer could eventually open a micro dairy and sell gourmet ice cream and other products, which he says would possibly be operated by a new generation of farmers. In Arundel, Vivian Lee, News Center, Maine.
A public hearing on the plan is set for June 12th. Finalizing a plan to begin distribution of the funds is expected in July.
Forever chemicals have been found in Maine wells and food packaging, and now traces of PFAS have been found in wildlife.
Yeah, and it's impacting tourism in places where hunting and fishing are key parts of our economy. There are some do not eat advisories in parts of Maine for fish and deer, and expanding testing them for PFAS. Staff of the Sportsman Alliance of Maine believes that more testing will likely find the chemicals in some other game as well, which means outdoor tourism could ultimately suffer. Maine is not the only state that's dealing with this problem right now. Michigan, Wisconsin also issuing do not eat orders because of this.
As a small business owner, time management is key. So today I'm using Adobe Express to come up with a new fall banner.
They came in and said, don't drink it, don't drink it. It's poisoned. I said, what?
Industrial sludge has been spread across Maine for decades. Now the toxic mystery is coming to light.
I'm mad, I'm furious.
The industrial chemicals should not be in our water. What they did is they gave us all a death sentence.
Without a clear solution, these Mainers are scared and upset.
They woke up the sleeping giants in Fairfield. All it did was piss us off.
For years now, right here, we've been telling you about how farms all across Maine have been contaminated with municipal sludge used as fertilizer that contain toxic PFAS chemicals.
But food from those farms isn't the only way Mainers have been exposed to the compounds. They're called forever chemicals because they can't be broken down by water or solvents. They can also be found in food wrappers, nonstick cookware, and cosmetics, and they're used to make furniture stain-proof. So how can we work with our doctors to find out our own level of exposure?
News Center Maine's Vivian Lee shows us.
Dr. Rachel Criswell is a family practitioner at Reddington Fairview General Hospital. She has about a dozen patients who have elevated levels of toxic compounds known as PFAS in their blood, but monitoring their health has been challenging.
It was really hard to understand sort of what level of PFAS should we be concerned about.
Some of the patients are from the Fairfield area, where residents have some of the highest levels in their blood and drinking water, not only in Maine, but across the country. Previously, federal health officials did not recommend blood testing because the majority of the U.S. population is believed to already have some level of PFAS in their systems. Exposure to the chemicals, which take years to break down, has been linked to a number of health issues, from organ cancer to thyroid problems. Recent National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine guidelines say blood testing for people with current or past exposure is needed to better monitor possible health concerns. Elevated levels trigger recommended screenings for both adults and children.
It also includes thyroid testing for adults, and it includes screening for kidney cancer with a urine, screening for signs and symptoms of ulcerative colitis, as well as additional cholesterol screening for children.
Dr. Abby Fleisch is a pediatric endocrinologist and environmental researcher at Maine Medical Center. She is working to help educate primary care doctors about the new recommendations, but she says there is no lab capacity for PFAS blood testing that could be out of reach for many patients.
The ability for a provider to order a PFAS test is limited in Maine, and insurance doesn't always cover the test or covers only part of the cost of the test.
Now, a blood serum test for PFAS can run anywhere from $300 to $600, and that expense is the focus of a bill pending before the legislature. The proposal, sponsored by State Senator Stacey Brenner, would require all Maine insurance carriers to cover the cost of the testing. PFAS contamination from spreading wastewater biosolids shut down Fred Stone's century-old dairy farm more than 5 years ago.
My son and my daughter are more affected by this than we are because they were poisoned, if you want to call it that, when they were adolescents.
Living with high levels of chemicals is a ticking time bomb, but Stone is grateful for the new PFAS guidance he believes is long overdue. Vivian Lee, News Center, Maine.
A state task force is working to identify the most serious threats to the public's health and the environment from forever chemicals known as PFAS.
Used for decades in everything from carpets to firefighting foam, the industrial chemicals, which take years to break down, are linked to cancer, thyroid, and immune system problems.
Earlier this year, we told you how PFAS pollution shut down a century-old dairy farm in York County. And now a state task force wants to know if other farms across the state are also at risk. News Center's Vivian Lee is here to tell us more. Viv?
Well, Cindy and Pat, Fred Stone and his family lost everything after discovering their farm was fertilized with sludge laced with man-made chemicals. Now they're worried about the impact PFAS contamination will have on their health over the long term.
What are you doing?
Fred Stone and his wife Laura stopped drinking milk from their cows more than 2 years ago. Tests found PFAS in their groundwater, soil, and milk, nearly 10 times the EPA safe limit.
They're just dumping it down the drain.
Still, the couple had up to 20 times the national average of forever chemicals in their blood.
What the long-term health concerns are going to be for both myself and my wife, and the cows. I mean, good God, the cows didn't ask for this, and I don't know what we're going to do.
The contamination comes from biosludge that was spread on more than half of the fields on the 90-acre farm. local farmers to use the sludge as soil enhancer. Stone started using sludge, which came from local sewer districts and paper mills, back in the mid-1980s. With his dairy operation shut down, Stone is suing the manufacturers of the chemicals to compensate for his losses, which are in the hundreds of thousands of dollars.
These chemicals, number one, don't biodegrade. In other words, they almost last forever. And number two, they pose serious human health risks. But those companies did not disclose that information to the general public.
Late this spring, the Maine DEP began requiring all sewage treatment plants to test for 3 specific varieties of PFAS in treated sludge. A number of facilities distribute the sludge to farmers.
Compost their sludge.
A task force is still reviewing the test results. DEP Commissioner Jerry Reed says agencies like DEP are also trying to find out if they have the authority to regulate the chemicals. Currently, there are no state or federal rules for PFAS regarding sludge.
And there are many things that really we're not set up to deal with because we lack the resources, and we need to count on the federal government to take a leadership role in that.
The task force is required to report back to the legislature by the end of this year, and that report is expected to trigger a number of bills addressing PFAS contamination. Stone, in the meantime, says his friends have encouraged him to sell everything and move on, but he says he's too attached to his cows and his land that has been in his family for more than 100 years.
The problem is that when we get up in the morning, we go out in the barn, there it is. You just don't walk away from that. There it is.
Now, a bill is pending in Congress, which was co-sponsored by Congresswoman Shelley Pingree. It would require the EPA to designate PFAS chemicals as a hazardous substance within a year. So we'll see if they'll take up that bill and make that a reality. So
thank you, movement. Thank you.
Recordings just got better. Hey, it's Dana from StreamYard. I'm so excited to announce that
New Hampshire is the first state in the country to require local water systems, landfills, and wastewater plants to regularly test for contaminants known as forever chemicals. Thursday, state lawmakers approved new lower standards for PFAS compounds. The acronym stands for a class of thousands of industrial chemicals used in household products to military-grade firefighting foam. They're called forever chemicals because they can take decades to break down in the environment. The tough new standards on drinking water will take effect in October. For decades, toxic foam loaded with PFAS made it into the local water supply during firefighting training exercises at Pease Air National Guard Base.
Airmen who served at Pease believe that the water and exposure to more than a dozen toxic chemicals are causing organ-related cancers. When we first brought you this story last fall, 42 veterans had died. Well, now that number stands at 67. Several former airmen are now fighting for screenings for veterans who may be at risk for cancer. NewsHeader's Vivian Lee has the story.
Gorham resident Gary Enos started as an aircraft mechanic at the Pease Air National Guard Base more than 30 years ago. But as a young airman, he wasn't aware of the dangers working with chemicals without protective equipment.
Figuratively up to your elbows in these chemicals every day, gassing airplanes, washing airplanes, de-icing them.
During his career, he watched his fellow airmen die of organ-related cancers. Then a close call. Early detection found prostate cancer and then bladder cancer several years ago. He wants his fellow veterans who may not know they're at risk for cancer to get screened.
Early detection, it's the only thing that's going to save you. It's the only thing.
Enos believes former and current airmen should be treated the same like firefighters.
Numbers are in the circles.
More communities, including Rockland, are providing mobile health screenings for firefighters who have a higher risk for cancer.
The only difference between us and firefighters, I believe, is that they will inhale some of these toxins through smoke.
Widows of former Pease airmen who died from organ cancers are pushing for a federal health study. The study could determine the rate of cancer among former members from Pease. It could include personnel who served at the base from the 70s until 2018. Now, in his statement, the commander of the wing, Colonel John Pagoric, tells News Center that officials are waiting on the Air Force Medical Support Agency to approve a study. If that study goes forward and finds a connection to cancer cases, the wing would push strongly for screenings for current and former airmen. Enos, in the meantime, is about to undergo his 5th procedure for bladder cancer in 2 years. He's screened every 3 months to make sure the aggressive cancer is not spreading. a battle he will probably have to deal with the rest of his life, but he's grateful he's still here to fight. In Portland, Vivian Lee, News Center, Maine.
A group of Fairfield residents are considering taking legal action after more residential wells were found to be tainted with high levels of forever chemicals known as PFAS.
The Department of Environmental Protection says 29 wells have now tested higher than the EPA advisory levels for these industrial chemicals. The compounds were first discovered in milk from the Tozier dairy farm nearly a year ago. The tainted milk was pulled from the shelves. The source of the contamination, biosolids used on farmland as fertilizer. News Center's Vivian Lee has an update.
State regulators have sampled water from more than 100 private wells near the Tozier dairy farm. So far, 29 wells show levels exceeding the EPA's advisory levels, some as much as 8 to 15 times above the safe limit. Town officials are distributing free bottled water at the Fairfield Benton Fire Department to impacted residents.
There will be water available for residents for however long it takes until they have filtration systems installed.
State regulators are expected to begin installing carbon filtration systems a week from Monday. The contamination is believed to be from biosolids applied to the dairy farm fields for nearly 2 decades, a practice that is allowed in Maine. The compounds are linked to a number of health issues, including immune system problems and organ cancers.
We had concerns about what was in that sludge right from the beginning.
Penny Harkins grew up just yards away from those fields. She sells tropical coral and fish, relying on a filtration system, but she worries about the long-term health impacts of drinking contaminated water for years. Her husband, with no history of heart disease, died of a heart attack several years ago.
Every doggone awful health issue you can imagine. There's 5 widows on this 1 mile stretch of road.
Harkins says she and other residents are looking to the possibility of filing a class action lawsuit. They're also working with environmental activist Aaron Brockovich, known for fighting water contamination. Regulators in the meantime are continuing to sample wells near the farm and in other areas of central Maine where biosolids were used as fertilizer. In Fairfield, Vivian Lee, News Center, Maine.
Last month, federal health officials released a troubling report linking so-called forever chemicals to potentially increasing the risk of getting COVID-19.
PFAS chemicals are a class of non-stick, waterproof, stain-resistant compounds used in consumer and industrial products. Studies show PFAS exposure could also reduce the effectiveness of certain vaccines in both children and adults. These findings are galvanizing advocates to push for tougher limits for PFAS chemicals in Maine's drinking water. News Center Maine's Vivian Lee has more.
Even before the global pandemic, PFAS contamination was a growing concern across the nation and in Maine. Known as forever chemicals because they can remain in the human body and the environment for decades.
Chief 1, control.
The chemicals are found in firefighting foams as well as a variety of household products. Exposure has been linked to testicular and kidney cancers, high cholesterol and thyroid disease, and suppressing our body's ability to produce antibodies to fight viruses, including COVID-19. Patrick McCroy is the Deputy Director of the Environmental Health Strategy Center.
That's really troubling as we're contending with a major outbreak.
In June, the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, ATSDR, issued a statement about the potential link between PFAS and the virus. Other studies found that includes childhood vaccines and adult vaccines for the flu. The report said, quote, there is evidence from human and animal studies that PFAS exposure may reduce antibody responses to vaccines and may reduce infectious disease resistance.
The PFAS chemicals may be weakening folks' immune systems now, and they may make the vaccine less effective.
There are no federal safety standards for PFAS in drinking water. The EPA's current health advisory, which is not binding for 2 of the chemicals, PFOA and PFOS, is at 70 parts per trillion. A final report by Governor Mills' PFAS task force late last year stopped short of recommending lower limits for the chemicals in drinking water. Several New England states, including Vermont and New Hampshire, have adopted much stricter standards.
And they just recommend that people follow the outdated EPA standard that's nearly 10 times higher than what would be allowed in neighboring states.
Advocates hope to continue to push for new limits for PFAS in drinking water when the legislature reconvenes. Redstone century-old dairy farm was shut down after PFAS was discovered in the groundwater, soil, and milk, 10 times the EPA's safe limit. A pending bill that would change Maine's statute of limitations law would allow the dairy farmer to sue in civil court.
We really want to see that get through this year so that folks like Fred Stone can go to court and try to get justice for what has happened to them.
A bill authorizing regulators to clean up sites contaminated by the chemicals and require those responsible to pay for it passed the Maine House before the pandemic hit. It's not known when any of these bills will be taken up by lawmakers in the future. In Arundel, Vivian Lee, News Center, Maine.
Maine already has a plan to phase out the use of forever chemicals in food packaging.
Yeah, but now environmental regulators are moving forward with a proposal to require manufacturers to tell us if those chemicals are in our clothing or any other household items. The Maine Department of Environmental Protection is looking to have per and polyfluoroalkyl listed as priority chemicals. I'm sure I got the hard one. He's got that one right. That would require manufacturers to disclose what products contain the chemical, how much of it, and why it's actually needed in the first place. The Portland Press Herald says that Maine already has established 8 chemical classes as priority chemicals in an effort to reduce children's contact with toxic substances.
Every minute, one garbage truck full of plastic is dumped into our oceans.
We can't fix it.
Environmental regulators in Maine are planning to undertake a statewide investigation to find concentrations of forever chemicals, also known as PFAS. The investigation stems from the state's efforts to mitigate these chemicals. They're a problem in parts of the state due to the long-standing use of municipal sludge and paper mill waste from farm fertilizer. The state set aside $30 million to test for the chemicals and install filtration systems in areas with contaminated water. Now, a study into forever chemicals is giving a number of consumers pause before putting on makeup. Researchers at the University of Notre Dame found more than 3/4 of waterproof mascara, nearly 2/3 of foundations, and liquid lipsticks they tested have high levels of PFAS chemicals.
Wow. The compounds used to increase a product's durability and wear are linked to cancer, immune system damage, and other health problems. News Center Maine's Vivian Lee has more.
There are industrial compounds that are used in countless products, including nonstick cookware, carpets, furniture, as well as firefighting foams. Exposure to PFAS chemicals, which are showing up in water supplies throughout the country, has been linked in federal studies to cancer, reproductive harm, and damage to the immune system. Another area of growing concern, cosmetics. A recent study by the University of Notre Dame found that almost half of the makeup tested by researchers contain the harmful chemicals.
Based on what we know about these chemicals, they shouldn't be in products at all.
David Andrews is a senior scientist with the Environmental Working Group, a Washington nonprofit that has worked to restrict PFAS. Previously, Andrews worked with Graham Peasley, the principal investigator of the Notre Dame study, researching PFAS in food wrappers. Researchers tested more than 200 products and discovered compounds in 52% of them. The study did not list the brands which were purchased from big box retailers in the US and Canada. The highest levels of fluorine, an indicator of PFAS, were found in makeup designed to stay on longer and marketed as wear-resistant, long-lasting, and waterproof.
They were detected at the highest levels in waterproof, long-lasting mascara, lipstick type products.
Also, nearly 90% of the makeup products tested lacked information about these ingredients on their product labels. Now, at this time, scientists are not sure how much consumers are being exposed to the chemicals by putting these products on their skin. One thing for sure, they say that any of these chemicals will end up in sensitive areas.
And this is really of significant interest and of concern for the public and people who apply cosmetics, especially to your face and your lips and your eyes, because we know that PFAS are so incredibly toxic at low concentrations.
In July, Maine became the first state to ban all PFAS from being intentionally added to any product sold in our state. That law will take effect in 2030. The sale of new carpets or fabric treatments with PFAS are prohibited as of January of 2023. Patrick McCroy is the Deputy Director of Defender Health, a national nonprofit based in Portland that works to eliminate toxic chemicals in food products and water.
And that will allow us to have a better sense of where we should be targeting efforts to replace PFAS with safer alternatives.
The FDA does not require pre-market safety testing or registration of product ingredients in cosmetics. It relies on manufacturers to ensure that their products are safe. Consumers, meanwhile, are encouraged to look for products that say PFAS-free. Vivian Lee, News Center, Maine.
A bill co-sponsored by Senator Susan Collins seeking to ban the toxic chemicals is also making its way through Congress. We have links to that legislation and more information on PFAS on our website and mobile app.
More than 60 farms across Maine have been flagged by regulators as having some type of contamination from toxic chemicals known as PFAS.
The industrial compounds were in wastewater sludge trucked to farms used as fertilizer, leaching into well water and soil for decades. A number of farms had to pull their products from shelves, including Misty Brook Farm, which is in Albion. Well, now, a little year later, the organic farm is finally emerging from the crisis, but there are still challenges. News Center Maine's Vivian Lee has an update.
The work never stops at Misty Brook Farm. Cows and calves, sheep and pigs need to be fed and stalls cleaned out. The farm sits on more than 600 acres and is owned by Brendan and Keisha Holmes. The father of three says the operation is finally beginning to emerge from what many would describe as a year from hell.
Cash flow is really tight. We're behind on some of our bills.
Almost a year ago, the couple had to replace an entire herd of Jersey cows after they consumed hay contaminated with PFAS chemicals purchased from an organic farm. That farm was not aware of the contamination at the time. Misty Brook was forced to pull dairy and meat products from more than 50 stores and pay for their testing. That included disposing 6,000 pounds of meat inventory in the landfill and throwing away milk from contaminated cows.
And dump their milk every day for 11 months until their levels finally were down to non-detect.
State agricultural officials test the milk every other week and have approved putting dairy products from the impacted cows back on the shelves. The farm's pork and beef are also testing below the state's safety limits. The couple is also working on transitioning 100 acres of their land that was flagged for low levels of the chemicals after being spread with sludge years ago.
Into grain production because the grain seeds don't pick up the compounds.
The couple is still waiting for payments for the loss of tens of thousands of gallons of milk from the USDA's Dairy Indemnity Payment Program, which disqualifies the farm from getting help from the state's income replacement program. Keisha, who sits on two different subcommittees managing a $60 million PFAS fund, is grateful that their customers and the community stuck by them. PFAS testing results on their products are all available on the farm's website, and she hopes their efforts will inspire other farms.
Prove that there's a way to move forward and be an example for other people to continue.
To find new and safe ways to farm their land. In Albion, Vivian Lee, News Center, Maine. Andrea Amico remembers learning her family had been exposed to toxic chemicals.
Feeling really upset that my family was exposed and not knowing what that could mean for their health.
Andrea's husband and two older children drank the water contaminated with PFAS chemicals at the Pease Trade Port at work and at daycare. But nearly 7 years later, she is no closer to finding out the long-term impact on her family's health.
I still don't have any more answers. I think I just have a whole lot more worry as science does continue to evolve about PFAS.
The so-called forever chemicals, which take years to break down, were in the firefighting foam used in training exercises at the base. The chemicals seeped into the water supply for decades. Amico, along with other moms, fought for years for our first in the nation federal health study. After being put on hold due to the pandemic, the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry is recruiting kids and adults who drank the water at Pease between 2004 and 2014. Participants can schedule blood and health screenings. Children must also undergo neurobehavioral assessments.
Here today for the Pease study.
Federal health experts hope to recruit 1,000 adults and 350 children. So far, a little more than 500 adults and 92 kids have signed up. Another study, also delayed by the pandemic, is resuming, possibly next month. The PFAS REACH study, conducted by the nonprofit Silent Spring Institute, is looking for 60 kids whose moms worked at Pease for at least a year before June of 2014 and drank the water while pregnant or breastfeeding. It will focus on if the industrial compounds make early childhood vaccines less effective.
Children who've had higher PFAS exposures may have lower levels of antibodies in response to routine vaccinations.
Now, neither study will follow families long term, but both will provide key research for what has become a national issue.
It's going to help millions of Americans across the country better understand the health impacts of PFAS.
Answers families desperately want now, but experts say that data may not be available for at least 5 more years. In Portsmouth, New Hampshire, Vivian Lee, News Center, Maine.
Environmental advocates want stricter standards for industrial chemicals known as PFAS, as the number of contaminated wells in Fairfield is expected to grow. So far, 29 wells have levels of PFAS chemicals above the EPA's advisory limit.
The contamination is believed to be linked to industrial biosolids spread on fields belonging to the Tozier Dairy Farm. News Center Maine's Vivian Lee has our follow-up report.
PFAS-laced sludge or biosolids used as fertilizer led to the shutdown of Fred Stone's Central Dairy Farm several years ago. High levels of industrial chemicals were found in milk, fields to blood samples from Stone and his family. Local sewer and water districts paid Stone and other farmers to use industrial sludge on their fields, a state-approved program dating back to the late 70s involving dozens and dozens of farms.
It was cheap for the water treatment plants to get rid of it, and it was cheap, quote, fertilizer for the farmers at our expense.
The chemicals are linked to a number of health issues, including immune system problems and organ cancers. The compounds were first discovered in milk from the Tozier Dairy Farm nearly a year ago and pulled from the shelves. The source is believed to be sludge spread on farmland just yards from Penny's home.
Our homes don't have any value. We've got all kinds of health issues. Who's going to help us with those?
After the discovery of contamination on Stone's property, the Department of Environmental Protection released a list of every location in the state that has received sludge. While a state PFAS task force recommended sampling these sites, that hasn't happened. Patrick McCroy is a deputy director of Defend Our Health, an organization that works to eliminate toxic chemicals in food products and water. He says the public needs to know if more contaminated farms exist.
But the reality is people have a right to safe drinking water, and we need to actually test to find folks who do not have safe drinking water.
The nonprofit is working on legislation that would require state regulators to test sites that have received potentially contaminated sludge. Another proposed bill, a state standard for PFAS in drinking water, lower than the EPA's limit, and it would follow standards set by Vermont and Massachusetts. In Fairfield, Vivian Lee, News Center, Maine.
David Medore, the acting commissioner of the DEP, tells News Center Maine that there are 5 sites in Maine that are receiving municipal sludge. The agency is also testing sites in Wells and Unity Township. We have more information on our website and our mobile app.
They came in and said, don't drink it, don't drink it, it's poisoned. I said, what?
Industrial sludge has been spread across Maine for decades. Now the toxic mystery is coming to light.
I'm mad, I'm furious.
The industrial chemicals should not be in our water. What they did is they gave us all a death sentence.
Without a clear solution, these Mainers are scared and upset.
They woke up the sleeping giants in Fairfield. All it did was piss us off.
The Environmental Protection Agency has officially designated forever chemicals as hazardous substances. The toxic compounds known as PFAS have been used in cookware, firefighting foams, and have been found in drinking water. This designation means that high levels of PFAS would have to be reported to federal, state, or tribal officials. The EPA could then require cleanups to protect public health and recover cleanup costs. The chemicals can accumulate and stay in the human body for long periods of time and can lead to cancer or other health problems.
All right, Aaron, we'll see you in a bit. A new lab at the University of Maine in Orono will soon help guide farmers who are sort of grappling with fields and wells contaminated with toxic chemicals known as PFAS.
The PFAS Research Center will be paid for with $8 million in federal money, and it will have the capacity to test the water, the soil, and also animal tissue for those chemicals. News Center Maine's Vivian Lee gives us a closer look.
A new PFAS research lab at the University of Maine at Orono will provide an important tool in the battle against contamination from PFAS compounds. Hannah Carter is the dean of the UMaine Cooperative Extension, which will run the facility.
There are so many testing needs across the state when it comes to PFAS.
The $8 million lab, funded by a federal spending bill, may be located in existing lab space on campus and at the Cooperative Extension Lab, which houses the TIC lab and other research areas. It will not take samples directly from private landowners, but is expected to ease the bottleneck at commercial labs. Carter says the lab will have 3 PFAS testing units.
We'll have one dedicated to water, one dedicated to soil, one dedicated to tissue. And again, whether that's plant tissue, animal tissue.
The toxic compounds are in everyday household products and take decades to break down. They have also been linked to serious health problems. The chemicals are in wastewater sludge, which for decades was spread as fertilizer on Maine farms. Regulators are currently in the process of testing hundreds of farms over the next several years. With minimal testing capacity, state agencies send samples out of state, with results taking weeks, even months.
If we have an in-house ability for them to come with their samples, get immediate results, not have to mail them out.
The lab will tap UMO researchers who've been working on PFAS issues for years, including Onur Opul. The environmental engineering professor is utilizing a $250,000 grant from the National Science Foundation to see if a souped-up version of granular activated carbons, like the one found in home water filters, can effectively break down PFAS. Another part of the federal funding will go to studying crops that may be able to grow on contaminated farmland in Maine. Corn has already been shown to suck chemicals out of the soil into the stalk, but not the ear.
We can figure this out and we can keep farmland in Maine. And, it's not, I feel like it's not a life sentence.
David Trahan is the executive director of the Sportsmen's Alliance of Maine. He has pushed for an in-state PFAS lab since November of 2021. That's when a do not eat advisory for deer harvested in the Fairfield and surrounding communities was issued after several animals tested positive for elevated levels of PFAS.
People harvested deer, had PFAS in the meat, and they fed it to their families. And the reason we got so engaged is that we never wanted that to happen again.
The hope is to have part of the lab up and running to do test samples during the spring planting season, which typically begins in April. The lab could be fully operational by the fall. In Orono, Vivian Lee, News Center, Maine.
This is certainly a topic we'll keep tracking. We will have much more information about the new PFAS Research Center and the state's ongoing investigation into contamination across the state.
Maine residents who hunt will be heading into the woods this Saturday, hoping to bag a deer, but there are growing concerns that the meat they harvest will contain toxic chemicals.
Last November, a do not eat advisory was issued for deer harvested in the Fairfield and surrounding communities after several animals tested positive for elevated levels of industrial chemicals known as PFAS. With no testing capability in Maine, backlogs at out-of-state labs are delaying testing results for this year's season. But as News Center Maine's Vivian Lee reports, an in-state lab could be several years from reality.
Maine wildlife biologists took samples from 60 deer in Fairfield and other surrounding communities considered a hotspot for PFAS contamination. Those samples were sent to a lab in Massachusetts in late August, but no results yet.
Unfortunately, nationally, there's a huge backlog of testing results for PFAS, and it's been over 40 days now.
Mark Laddie is the spokesman for the Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife. A do not eat advisory was issued last year for deer harvested in the Fairfield area after elevated levels were discovered in 8 deer. Laddie says results from a bigger sample of deer, along with migration patterns, could give biologists new answers.
Once a deer gets away from some of those contaminated sites, is there less PFAS in the system? Does it eventually, work its way out of the system.
The delay, though, is again raising health concerns as deer season gets underway.
Last time around, people had already put the meat in their freezer. They were feeding it to their families, and it come to find out it was contaminated with PFAS.
David Trahan is executive director of the Sportsmen's Alliance of Maine, which represents more than 30,000 sportsmen and women. He's calling for the legislature to fast track the issue.
We have to have our own lab, expedite it, and start testing.
Congress, in the meantime, has yet to approve as much as $8 million in federal earmarks that would establish a first-of-its-kind PFAS research center and lab at the University of Maine in Orono. Experts estimate it could take several years before the lab is up and running. Now, those testing results could be available as soon as next week, and that would give wildlife officials, along with the Maine CDC, a complete picture as to whether another do not eat advisory for harvested deer is warranted. And samples from more than 24 turkeys in the Fairfield area this past spring didn't result in a do not eat advisory, but more testing could take place next year. Vivian Lee, News Center, Maine.
And we'll have more information on PFAS and the state's ongoing investigation into hotspots of contamination on our website and our News Center Maine app. It's a crisis happening in real time that's threatening the livelihoods of dozens of Maine farms. A toxic disaster centered on wastewater sludge tainted with industrial compounds known as PFAS, or forever chemicals. Good evening, everyone. I'm Amanda Hill.
And I'm Pat Callahan. PFAS chemicals permeate our lives. They are called forever chemicals because water and solvents can't break them down. Because of that, they're used to make fast food wrappers grease resistant, make pots and pans non-stick. They're even used in cosmetics. They also make stain-proof fabrics and make firefighter turnout gear waterproof.
So how did PFAS end up in farmland? About 40 years ago, the state arranged to have industrial and household waste that was turned into sludge at wastewater treatment plants trucked to farms across Maine, where the sludge was used as free fertilizer year after year for decades. What the farmers didn't know was that sludge contained high levels of PFAS, which leached into the soil and groundwater, poisoning hundreds of neighboring wells. Lawmakers are now scrambling to try to save farmers from financial ruin, as statewide testing is expected to reveal a much larger scale of contamination.
But for a York County dairy farm considered ground zero for the PFAS crisis, it's a never-ending nightmare. News Center Maine's Vivian Lee has more from Arundel.
Fred Stone and his wife Laura met showing farm animals in high school. The couple took over this historic Stone Ridge farm in the mid-70s, supplying several thousand gallons of milk weekly for Oakhurst Dairy. But the operation hasn't produced any milk in more than 5 years.
We thought we could rectify and salvage the operation. Our farm goes back well over 100 years.
In November of 2016, high levels of so-called forever chemicals known as PFAS were discovered in his well, milk, and soil. 2.5 years later, Fred spoke out publicly for the first time, telling us how he was forced to pull thousands of gallons of milk from the shelves. The majority of the farm's Holstein and Brown Swiss cows also had to be put down. Despite buying clean cows and paying for testing and filtration systems, Stone Ridge Farm hasn't recovered from the financial and emotional blow.
Spending hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars, my Linda would be more than happy to tell you that, to no avail.
PFAS chemicals were in municipal wastewater sludge, including industrial waste from paper mills. Starting in the early 1980s, Fred and hundreds of other farmers were encouraged to use the sludge as fertilizer to prevent it from ending up in landfills.
We helped the towns out, the towns helped us out.
This is Stone's license to spread sludge, issued by the Department of Environmental Protection back in 1986. It states the leftover waste won't pollute water or cause a health hazard.
This material is safe to use on your farm as a soil amendment.
PFAS doesn't break down in the environment and the human body. Fred and his family, meanwhile, have high levels of the chemicals in their blood. All have health issues doctors can't explain.
I have full-blown Parkinson's where I take the meds and I fall down a lot and everything else. And there's no family history.
Throw them on the sides like this.
130 miles away in rural Waldo County, Scott McCormick recalls watching the demise of Fred's farm on our newscasts.
There's no way that's going to be up here in Jackson, Maine on a dead-end road.
10 years ago, Scott bought 100 acres with dreams of raising hay, produce, and livestock for his family and customers. He also discovered his fields had been treated with sludge for more than a decade. At that time, Scott wasn't worried because of the same promises DEP listed on the farm's sludge permit.
I thought it was safe. I thought it's old farm ground, and we're going to restore it.
But his family's world turned upside down in February when their farm was identified as a hotspot for PFAS contamination. Rather than wait on state regulators, the couple tested their drinking water. The results showed PFAS chemicals nearly 70 times above Maine's safe limit. The couple, who have a 7-year-old daughter, also just welcomed a baby girl. State medical officials said the chemicals could pass to the baby through breast milk. But Scott's wife was still encouraged to continue breastfeeding for the health benefits.
She's breastfeeding. The baby's fine. We're fine right now, but we're still scared because no one really knows at what levels is something going to happen.
Lawmakers are taking the first step in providing a safety net of tens of millions of dollars to address the crisis in real time. So far, testing has identified 10 farms with high levels of the chemicals, but that process is expected to take years.
Even though $100 million sounds like a lot of money, we don't totally know the scope of PFAS contamination yet and how many farms will be impacted.
Amanda Beal is the commissioner of the Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry. She recently testified in favor of legislation that would set up an advisory committee. Now, that committee is expected to be made up of food producers, farmers, environmental and health experts, and they would allocate funds to cover impacted farmers' health and business costs, expanded testing, research, buy contaminated land, and long-term health monitoring. Scott, meanwhile, is waiting for the results of blood tests he had to pay for, which could run more than $1,000. Samples from his livestock are safe, but additional testing of soil and hay, his primary crop, will take place later this spring. If his fields are found to be contaminated, there are very few options.
I am for solar panels and all that, but not looking out my front door. I just didn't buy this for this.
As for Fred, that help will be too little, too late. The third-generation farmer surviving on government assistance and the generosity of others is stuck with acres of contaminated land no one will touch.
You've taken my value away.
And no price tag is expected to make this farm and his family whole again. In Arundel, Vivian Lee, News Center, Maine.
Governor Janet Mills has proposed $60 million in aid to farmers. The final figure will be released when the supplemental budget is approved within the next couple of weeks.
The state is also working on a short-term income replacement program for farmers with contaminated land, and farm advocacy groups are raising relief funds as well. We have more information on our website and our News Center Maine app.
They are called forever chemicals because they do not naturally break down in the environment, nor in the human body. The compounds known as PFAS are found in numerous products from cookware to carpets to packaging.
But a University of Maine researcher believes he may have found a way to take the forever out of the compounds. He and his team were focusing on existing water filtration technology and trying to use it to find a solution to a growing public health crisis. News Center Maine's Vivian Lee has the story from Orono.
Honora Poole is an assistant professor of environmental engineering. Over the next several years, he and his team will be researching how to eradicate PFAS chemicals, compounds considered virtually indestructible. Utilizing a $250,000 grant from the National Science Foundation, the focus is on water filtration systems used by homeowners and municipalities to filter out the toxic chemicals.
If we recover spent water filter materials, can we also destroy PFAS?
Those water systems use granular activated carbons that are slightly larger than coffee grounds to pull PFAS out of drinking water. The spent carbons end up in the runoff of landfills, putting rivers and other waterways at risk for contamination. Poole says recycling the carbons through thermal regeneration may wipe out the captured PFAS.
So we think at lower temperatures than expected, we could destroy PFAS, again giving us an upper hand for lower energy footprint.
Apul, who has researched PFAS for more than 7 years, says some studies show PFAS attached to carbons decompose through the thermal process. Finding out what properties of the carbons and the industrial compounds that actually destroy PFAS and still allow them to be recycled is expected to take several years. But eventually, it could lead to a possible solution to help residents and communities dealing with contamination.
We are happy to help them to overcome this unprecedented public health crisis in the short and in the long term.
A crisis that continues to unfold across Maine and the rest of the country. In Orono, Vivian Lee, News Center, Maine.
Apul and his team are also studying which PFAS compounds captured by carbons are more likely to break down in landfills. We'll have more information on the research on our website and our mobile app for you.
Stricter standards for so-called forever chemicals in drinking water are resulting in the discovery of more tainted private wells in central Maine. Earlier this summer, lawmakers approved a new level 3.5 times lower than the federal limit for industrial compounds known as PFAS.
According to new data from the Department of Environmental Protection, 137 wells in Fairfield tested above the state's limit. 37 tested above the limit in nearby Oakland, Benton, and Unity Township.
Residents say it's like living with a ticking time bomb. But as Vivian Lee reports, a new medical study is trying to find some key answers about their exposure.
Sue Otis says it's heartbreaking to watch her husband of 37 years fight for his life after being diagnosed with bladder cancer 7 years ago.
He's gone through living hell, I should say. The pain, the weight loss, the surgeries.
The couple blame exposure to PFAS chemicals that seeped into their drinking water for decades. State regulators say the contamination is linked to industrial biosolids spread on fields belonging to the Tozier Dairy Farm. The farmland abuts Otis's property along with nearly a dozen others.
It smelled so bad, so bad. Yeah, they would dump, and they'd leave it there to let it rot.
Levels in private drinking wells along Howe Road alone show numbers as high as 20 to 30,000 parts per trillion. The state's new drinking water limit is now 20 parts per trillion for the sum of 6 PFAS chemicals. Now, Sue's health is also in question after tests showed very high levels of PFAS in her and her husband's blood. Her doctor's only advice is to watch and wait.
He told me to look out for liver cancer and kidney cancer now.
Dr. Rachel Criswell is a family practitioner at Maine General Medical Center who's done extensive research on PFAS. The hospital and the Maine CDC has launched a study to make sure the blood serum diagnostic test being used by providers is adequately capturing the extent of the exposure. Now, doctors are continuing to recruit for the study. Letters are being sent out to residents in Fairfield and other communities whose private wells had high levels of PFAS contamination. And Dr. Criswell says the blood work she's seen from these residents are off the charts.
A lot of the levels we're seeing in Fairfield are higher than 95% of the American population.
Sue and other neighbors like Kathy Harrington and her family, who also have high blood levels, plan to seek financial damages in a pending lawsuit against PFAS manufacturers and the companies that use them. Their only course of action facing an uncertain future. In Fairfield, Vivian Lee, News Center, Maine.
The International Association of Firefighters, they represent thousands of first responders in Maine. They've now launched a legal effort to end the use of toxic chemicals in their turnout gear.
Earlier today at a conference in Las Vegas, the IAFF announced it has hired 3 legal teams to fight for new regulatory standards when it comes to firefighter turnout gear. Officials claim years of wearing equipment designed to save their lives is causing health problems among firefighters, including cancer. The turnout gear firefighters use is treated with industrial compounds to withstand very high temperatures. Michael Krause is the president of the Professional Firefighters of Maine, which supports the efforts by the IAFF to use PFAS-free alternatives.
Is a message that needs to be shouted out, and at the federal, state, and the consensus standard level, people need to step up and protect the protectors.
Krause says the majority of Maine fire departments require firefighters to wash their gear after responding to a fire. By the way, the PFAS-free gear is typically 3 times more expensive.
Safely removes pore gunk.
just like that. The #1 trusted blackhead remover, Biore.
For more than a year, we've been telling you about PFAS chemicals, which have been linked to several diseases in humans and which don't ever break down, giving them the nickname forever chemicals. Good evening. I'm Pat Callahan.
And I'm Amanda Hill in for Cindy Williams. The stories mostly had to do with individuals or neighborhoods saying they'd been exposed to PFAS. But this week, the state reported that the water supplies of entire towns are showing signs of PFAS contamination.
Here's News Center Maine's Shannon Moss.
The report from Maine CDC handed to the governor's PFAS task force said it found the so-called forever chemical in the water supplies of 9 out of 19 water systems tested so far this year. Among them, Lisbon Falls, Livermore Falls, Mexico, Sanford, Topsom, and Arundel. The samples were taken mostly at schools, water treatment plants, and mobile home parks. And of the 9 communities where PFAS was found, the highest concentrations were found at the Lisbon Water District, the Pejetsket School in Topsom, and the Georgetown Central School. But all were well below the 70 parts per trillion limit the EPA recommends. PFAS chemicals have been linked to low birth weight, high cholesterol, thyroid disease, and certain types of cancer. We asked Mike Beliveau of the Environmental Health Strategy Center how the chemicals are ending up in those water supplies.
These chemicals have been widely used and are still used in our state, not only at paper mills for making grease-resistant food packaging, but also in firefighting foams at airports, but even in floor waxes that are used in school gymnasiums that can run off and contaminate the well.
The cows didn't ask for this.
Governor Mills formed the task force after this farmer helped Beliveau's group sound the alarm last winter. Fred Stone and his wife Laura ran a dairy farm at Arundel on land he said he couldn't farm anymore because the bio sludge from paper mills and sewer districts that he spread on his fields for decades contaminated the hay he fed his cows, as well as the milk they produced.
The levels that I have, I'm very concerned about my wife and my daughter. I mean, and my cows.
The Stones also say tests showed they had 30 times the federal limit of PFAS chemicals in their blood. The sludge came from local sewer districts and paper mills that paid Stone and other farmers to dump it on their fields as fertilizer. As for these latest water test results, Bellevue says they're indicators of a much bigger problem that needs to be addressed.
So unfortunately, Maine has no enforceable drinking water standards, and we should. And we're hopeful that the state will step up and make some safety determinations that will drive down the exposure to these chemicals.
But there may be pushback on those statewide standards. During this latest round of water testing by Maine CDC, more than a dozen local water districts declined to let their water be tested for PFAS. Shannon Moss, News Center, Maine.
The task force that got the report from the Maine CDC is set to hand over to the governor its report on how to combat PFAS contamination. One proposal that most members seem to be getting behind: expanding testing of both public and private drinking water sources, and eventually requiring all community water systems with 25 or more people on them to be monitored for PFAS.
And tonight, more questions and answers for communities affected by forever chemicals during the pandemic. Good evening and thanks for joining us. I'm Clay Gordon.
And I'm Amanda Hill. Pat and Cindy are off tonight. You've heard the devastating stories about PFAS before. It's a class of chemicals linked to serious health problems.
But it gets worse. Now, forever chemicals could prevent some people from making the antibodies needed after getting the COVID-19 vaccine. News Center Maine's Vivian Lee explains.
There are over 9,000 of these chemicals.
On a national call with reporters, toxicologists who monitor PFAS chemicals say high levels of exposure could undermine COVID-19 vaccines rolling out across Maine and the country.
From everything that we know about these chemicals, we know that they do suppress the immune system.
Dr. Linda Birnbaum is retired director of the National Institute for Environmental Health Sciences. The compounds used for decades are in many household products, including furniture, carpet, and food packaging. Linked to organ cancers and reproductive problems, the chemicals may also limit the immune system's ability to make virus-fighting antibodies after getting a shot. This fall, nearly 24 homeowners in the town of Fairfield were advised to use bottled water after tests revealed very high amounts of the compounds. The possible source of the contamination, biosolids used as fertilizer on farmland for decades. Dr. Birnbaum says the vaccine's two-shot protocol may not be enough protection for people living in contaminated areas.
And instead of getting that one booster that's now required with the 2 mRNA vaccines, that maybe you would need a third booster.
Now, the CDC's Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry is studying the intersection between PFAS and the virus to see if exposure reduces vaccine protection. And that research is expected to be included in federal health investigations going on in 8 different states across the country. It's a big worry for Andrea Amico, whose husband and 2 young children, including her daughter Sophia, drank water laced with PFAS at the Pease trade port. Federal health officials are currently registering adults and children exposed to PFAS at the former base for a health study. But it was too late in the process to include the Pease community.
You know, as we all sit here and wait patiently for a COVID-19 vaccine is going to help us in this pandemic, people that have been impacted by PFAS exposure wonder, will the vaccine be effective for them?
Environmental activists and scientists, in the meantime, are urging the public to get vaccinated against COVID-19, especially people with PFAS exposure, to give their immune systems another weapon to fight the virus. Vivian Lee, News Center, Maine.
Health officials say tests can determine whether antibody levels are adequate following 2 doses of the vaccine. If those levels are low, a third booster could be necessary.
One of the farms in Maine affected by PFAS contamination will now be used as a site to study forever chemicals. Representatives for Farmland Trust say they bought the land and plan to use it to study how forever chemicals affect agricultural production. They say the main focus is finding possible ways to help fix soil contamination. The trust is now looking for research partners to work with. You can find more information about all of this on the organization's website, mainefarmlandtrust.com.
Nearly 24 specific recommendations to address contamination by so-called forever chemicals were published this week by the governor's PFAS task force.
Now, PFAS is a class of chemicals that have been linked to serious health problems, including cancer and thyroid issues. As News Center Maine's Vivian Lee reports, regulators are now pushing for the authority to clean up polluted sites, including a century-old dairy farm, which first put this issue on the map.
Fred Stone's dairy farm was shut down after tests found PFAS in the groundwater, soil, and milk, 10 times the EPA safe limit. But the contamination is ongoing beyond his farm.
So the chemicals that are on his land continue to leach into the aquifer. They continue to run off in the Kennebunk River.
Right now, the state does not have the authority to clean up the 90-acre property. The feds have also not sent any binding regulations regarding PFAS contamination.
Hazardous substance, pollutant, or contaminant.
But the state may soon step in. A bill being taken up by the legislature's Joint Standing Committee on Environment and Natural Resources would give the Department of Environmental Protection authority to clean up sites contaminated by PFAS and potentially require those responsible for the pollution to pay for it.
We would also look to see if there's a high concentration of PFAS in soil that was continuing to be a source to the groundwater and remove that.
This change will allow DEP to add to the list of things that are considered hazardous PFAS and other chemicals that they can then go and clean up without waiting for the federal government.
The proposal is one of about 24 recommendations that came out of a report by the governor's PFAS task force. But critics say the final report doesn't go far enough. Unlike several other New England states, including New Hampshire, members stopped short of recommending new limits for PFAS in drinking water.
People in Maine should not have to drink toxic water that would be illegal in our neighboring states.
Now, state testing last year revealed that biosludge used as compost or fertilizer throughout the state of Maine is contaminated with PFAS. That's why environmentalists are pushing for more steps, including testing of food and feed grown on those sites. In the meantime, the feds are expected to release rules limiting PFAS in drinking water across the country sometime this year. In Augusta, Vivian Lee, News Center, Maine.
Legislation that would give the DEP the authority to clean up contamination from PFAS chemicals will be taken up by lawmakers in a work session in the next few weeks. The final PFAS task force report is available on our website and mobile app.
The EPA is considering new rules that would restrict the amount of industrial chemicals known as PFAS in drinking water, but binding regulations are still several years away. However, consumers do have some options for their tap that are readily available.
A recent study tested the effectiveness of removing toxic chemicals in nearly a dozen water pitcher filters. News Center Maine's Vivian Lee gives an overview of those results.
I really wasn't sure what we were going to find.
Sydney Evans is a senior science analyst with the Environmental Working Group. The nonprofit dedicated to protecting human health and the environment recently tested 10 household name brand water pitchers on their effectiveness for removing industrial chemicals known as PFAS from tap water. PFAS are also known as forever chemicals because they do not easily break down in the environment or the body. Studies have linked them with increased risk of various cancers, among other health concerns. Researchers tested each pitcher's ability to filter out 25 different PFAS chemicals from actual tap water.
These were not laboratory tests with like spiked water samples. This was a real home tap that had PFAS amongst, all kinds of other things.
4 pitchers removed 98 to 100% of the PFAS compounds. Travel Berkey, Zero Water, Clearly Filtered, and the Epic Water Filter. Evans says other brands had a reduction of the chemicals ranging from 22 to 79%. Evans says the 4 pitchers have a higher price point than other brands in the report and may be out of reach for some consumers.
And maybe a lot of people already have Pures or Britas or Amazon Basics. We wanted people to have that information and to know that they do work to some extent, and less PFAS is better.
Christina Heininger is a spokesperson for PFAS-free Trenton. The group was formed after high levels of the toxic compounds were found in Trenton Elementary School in 2019. The water was remediated, and thanks to federal funding, dozens of residents, including Heininger, had their well water tested. The levels from her well, though, came back above the EPA's recommended safe limits for drinking water. Initially, she looked into getting a water pitcher similar to the ones listed in EWG's report.
You have to dispose of those filters. And if you're going to throw them in the trash, you are now throwing a hazardous chemical in your trash that's going to end up in the landfill.
Heininger opted instead for a reverse osmosis system that can be hooked up to your water supply with filters lasting far longer than a pitcher-style device. Researchers, meanwhile, point out that any filter is less likely to work as it nears the end of the manufacturer's recommended lifespan and should not be used beyond that date. Vivian Lee, News Center, Maine.
And right now in the News Center Maine app, you will find the full report on water pitcher filters from the Environmental Working Group and how you can get your water tested.
Follow up now to the state's new lawsuit going after several chemical manufacturers over contamination with the forever chemicals known as PFAS. This week, Maine's Attorney General filed 2 lawsuits against DuPont, 3M, and other companies seeking financial damages to pay for the state's PFAS contamination investigation. The legal action comes as concerns mount about the health effects of the compounds that are in consumer products, fabrics, food packaging, and firefighting foams. The lawsuits allege the companies knew about the health hazards of PFAS for decades, but promoted the chemical products as safe and appropriate for widespread use. Environmental advocacy organizations like Defend Our Health are applauding the long-awaited legal filings.
This is not the state's fault. This is not the farmer's fault. This is not, firefighters' fault. This toxic chemical comes from large billion-dollar corporations, and it's important that they pick up the tab for it.
Media representatives for 2 of the companies named in the lawsuit said they will vigorously defend their records of safety in court. You can read their full statements on our website and our News Center Maine app.
Finding ways to remove forever chemicals from soil, crops, and livestock are some of the topics at a regional PFAS and agricultural meeting at Colby College.
The meeting, which ends this evening, is a follow-up to a national symposium held last month at Michigan State University. Farmers impacted by PFAS contamination, scientists and educators from New England and Michigan are discussing discoveries to contain the toxic chemicals. Participants also toured a former dairy farm in Unity. Most of the fields are tainted with PFAS after they were fertilized with municipal sludge for decades. UMaine researchers are growing different varieties of forage crops. They will be tested to see which grasses take the most chemicals out of the soil. But experts say finding real solutions is a long way off.
Even if we could reduce by half with some of these management practices, it's not going to be enough for some farms.
Organizers of today's meeting hope to create a network of scientists to nonprofits to help speed up research so farmers can pivot their operations. We will have.
Last week, federal regulators took a first step towards stemming the flow of so-called forever chemicals.
The EPA will require facilities in a handful of states, not including Maine, to monitor wastewater for PFAS. The industrial compounds are found in a number of household products and firefighting foam. Studies have linked the chemicals to a number of health problems, including kidney disease and some cancers.
But parents and activists say the latest action by the feds falls short of needed mandatory regulations. Here's News Center Maine's Vivian Lee with more.
We have enough science to know these chemicals are really concerning. They build up in the body.
After Andrea Miko's family drank water laced with PFAS chemicals at the Pease trade port, she fought for a federal health study. 2 of her children, including her daughter Sophia, now 9, were exposed at daycare. Invented in the 1940s, the chemicals are in household products from carpets, furniture to firefighting foam. That foam was discharged for decades into the base's water supply during DoD training exercises. In November, the EPA announced a new interim strategy to possibly require factories and wastewater plants it oversees to test for the chemicals. The compounds are linked to liver and kidney disease, high cholesterol, and reproductive, developmental, and immune issues, and some organ cancers. Amico, who worries about the long-term health consequences, says these federal regulations don't go far enough.
We need the EPA to step in and take, strict action against PFAS. We need regulations. We need to hold polluters accountable.
Right now, the only EPA guidelines that exist for PFAS are non-binding. The Granite State is one of a handful of states, though, that have adopted their own more restrictive limits in drinking water and groundwater.
Our neighbors in New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, and many other states have set mandatory limits for PFAS, and they are almost all lower than the federal guidance level.
Patrick McCroy is the Deputy Director of Defend Our Health, formerly known as the Environmental Health Strategy Center. The nonprofit works to eliminate toxic chemicals in food products and water. He says the EPA's new guidance would not impact wastewater facilities here in Maine. Last year, a PFAS state task force stopped short of setting limits for the compounds. Another concern, more than half of the state's population relies on private wells, which are not regulated.
And we want to see protections put in place to make sure that everyone's drinking water is safe. And that's will require actually assessing whether or not they've been exposed to these forever chemicals, as well as even more routine contaminants.
Here today for the Pease study. Back in Seacoast, New Hampshire, a first-in-the-nation health study continues to recruit adults and children who drank the water on base following a months-long delay due to the pandemic. Appointments involve blood and other testing under strict COVID guidelines.
It's a very minimal commitment for something that really can have a big impact, not only for our community, but millions of people across the country.
And a chance to finally get some answers. In Portsmouth, New Hampshire, Vivian Lee, News Center, Maine.
We will have more information on how to enroll into the Pease Health Study on our website and social media app. Environmental advocates in Maine hope to introduce legislation early next year to address PFAS contamination in products and water sources.
Other news we're following: because of contamination from toxic chemicals known as PFAS, state lawmakers are considering an outright ban on spreading of sludge in Maine. The chemicals were in leftover sludge from wastewater treatment plants. For decades, that sludge was hauled to farms across the state and used as fertilizer.
It's expected to take years for regulators to test more than 700 potential sites for so-called forever chemicals. Meanwhile, some farmers are taking matters into their own hands. News Center Maine's Vivian Lee reports.
Johanna Davis and Adam Nordell own the Songbird Organic Farm in Unity, but the couple has stopped sales and pulled products from customer shelves following the discovery of high levels of PFAS in their water, soil, produce, and in their blood.
The water that we drink and use to irrigate our crops is over 400 times the state of Maine's safety threshold.
The farm posted this statement about halting sales on its website last week. The source of the contamination is believed to be wastewater sludge spread on the farm's fields in the early 1990s. The toxic chemicals have been linked in federal studies to health issues such as thyroid disease, liver problems, and organ cancers. Unity is one of 34 towns with 700 total sites identified by the Department of Environmental Protection as a top priority for PFAS testing. Instead of waiting for regulators, the couple, who have a 3-year-old, paid for their own testing to get answers.
Unfortunately, we are not alone. There are going to be more farms and more rural Maine residents affected by this.
The couple testified in favor of a bill that would close loopholes that allows contaminated sludge to be applied to land as long as the soil meets state screening standards. The legislature's Environment and Natural Resources Committee is expected to vote soon on an amendment that outright bans the spreading of sludge.
We cannot, in my view, continue to spread contaminants knowingly agricultural land and elsewhere. We just need to say, stop it.
And there are also growing concerns about composting practices that are allowed in Maine, where sludge is mixed with other materials and sold by waste companies to farmers, landscapers, and home garden stores. If approved, the amendment would also prohibit the sale or distribution of compost that contains sludge. According to the DEP, there are 4 wastewater treatment plants and 11 composting facilities licensed to handle the material. This couple, meanwhile, are left with burning questions.
What does this mean for our health? What does this mean for our child's health?
And a huge struggle to find a way forward for their farm. Vivian Lee, News Center, Maine.
Members of the Environment and Natural Resources Committee could vote on the amendment to prohibit sludge spreading next Monday. We'll have a lot more information on PFAS and the state's investigation and testing on our website and our News Center Maine app.
The federal government now has a law on the books in the battle against forever chemicals. President Biden signed a bill protecting first responders from PFAS into law this week. The focus here is on a foam that's used to put out liquid fires started by fuel. It's known for having forever chemicals in it. The legislation directs the Department of Homeland Security to eliminate exposure to PFAS from firefighting foam and other equipment. Maine Senator Susan Collins is listed as a co-sponsor of that bill, along with both of New Hampshire's senators. Attorneys general from 22 states, including Maine now, are asking a federal court to reject a proposed settlement over PFAS.
Last month, attorneys representing hundreds of communities reached a $10.3 billion deal with manufacturer 3M over the contamination of public water drinking systems with PFAS chemicals. These chemicals wind up in many water and grease-resistant consumer products. They don't break down in nature, and they've been linked to causing cancer and organ disease that can all be fatal. This deal would compensate many communities across the country, but the attorneys general say it lets 3M off too easily, and many of these places still don't know what the cleanup costs will be.
And the company 3M has reached a settlement now for more than $10 billion over PFAS contamination in public water systems. 3M is a chemical manufacturing company. It announced yesterday it will pay the money to water suppliers that have already detected those forever chemicals and those that might find them in the future. 3M says it plans to stop using PFAS by the end of 2025. The chemicals have been a serious problem here in Maine since many farmers have been using contaminated sludge as fertilizer. PFAS is linked with some serious health complications, including cancer and liver failure.
Now, environmental and health advocates are calling on outdoor retail giant REI to ban outdoor gear made with so-called forever chemicals from its stores.
Members of Defend Our Health and the Learning Disabilities Association of Maine presented a letter to the manager of the REI store in Westbrook this morning. The letter requests that REI ban the sale of products containing PFAS. A recent study published by the Toxic Free Future found PFAS in outdoor gear the company sells. Advocates also want the retailer to follow the lead of outdoor brand Patagonia. That company has committed to phasing out all PFAS in products by 2024.
There are alternatives, and we're just asking REI to protect their customers and move away from this dangerous toxic chemical in their products.
REI has not responded for a request for a statement, and more than 110,000 customers have signed petitions and emails to REI calling for action on PFAS in outdoor gear.
We begin our news tonight with the largest investigation of its kind in the state. The subject of the investigation, PFAS, or forever chemicals. They're called that because these chemicals don't naturally break down over time, and there's no known way to destroy them. Now, some of those chemicals are found in many household products and dumped down the drain or from industrial plants. Chemicals end up in the sludge left behind at wastewater treatment plants. For decades, that sludge was hauled to farms across Maine to be used as fertilizer, and the PFAS chemicals it contained leached into the groundwater. Tests now show that private wells near those farms have alarming levels that studies have linked to cancer, low birth weight, and other serious health problems. Even more alarming, the number of poisoned wells is growing. News Center Maine's Vivian Lee joins us now from Fairfield with the latest. Viv?
Well, Pat, impacted residents say they're trapped in a toxic nightmare as regulators from the Department of Environmental Protection are scrambling to find out if this PFAS contamination is isolated to this area or a much larger statewide problem.
And they've hurt us and our children and our animals.
What they did is they gave us all basically a death sentence.
Penny Harkins of Fairfield is talking about the same thing federal health officials are saying, that there's growing evidence linking PFAS or forever chemicals to numerous health problems from organ cancer